When did consumption become tuberculosis? Tuberculosis was commonly called consumption for many years. When did tuberculosis or TB overtake consumption as the common term, in English, for the disease? This engram isn't much use. It compares the use of the terms consumption and tuberculosis in American English from 1800 to 2000. Of course, the problem is that consumption means many other things. The engram does show tuberculosis peaking between 1900 and 1920, but what I am interested in is roughly when a typical English speaker might have shifted from referring to the disease as consumption to tuberculosis. The dictionaries to which I have access simply state that consumption is an archaic term for the disease.
Expanding on Janus's excellent suggestion, make the search string more context-specific. The switchover point is much clearer if you graph deaths from consumption/tuberculosis. So we can reasonably say tuberculosis was already gaining currency before World War I, but by the end of the war it had almost completely displaced consumption. Perhaps because when a major protracted war ends, people want to make a fresh start in terms of language as well as politics and society. My guess is that the actual cause of the disease, infection by tubercle bacillus, wasn't generally recognized until the turn of the century. The germ theory of disease is much associated with Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, but as it says in that link, during Louis Pasteur's lifetime, it was not easy for him to convince others of his ideas, controversial in their time but considered absolutely correct today.
Consumptive appears as a status in the US Census, or was written in by the census taker anyway, in 1870. The location was Brooklyn, although the residents were wealthy and established and non-immigrants. Going down the page, the status of consumptive pops up, twice on the page. My great-great-grandfather's mother-in-law was a consumptive and so was one of her neighbors.
History of tuberculosis. It was called consumption because it literally used to consume a person's life, but after advancements in medical theory and such, the use of tuberculosis started gaining prevalence. An extract from John Keats' biography which shows why the disease was called consumption. However that might be, Keats was aware of his condition, and the threat to his life. Consumption was not an uncommon illness in those days, and when it developed there was little hope. It was a scourge among all classes of society, and the doctors were impotent. For most sufferers a diagnosis of tuberculosis was a notice of death. Source: Britannia. It could also be because of lackadaisical attitude of people towards medical terms and information flow restriction. Conjecture: there are multiple names for tuberculosis used throughout history due to information restriction, and a layman's term must be consumption.
Consumption is a fairly recent name for TB. Try and gram search for phthisis, scrofula, white plague or Pott's disease. After many years of genealogical research I found phthisis was the foremost cause of death in Britain until the 1880s when consumption took over, easier to spell too. TB wasn't widely used in Britain until after 1919.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.